Hello, welcome to this limited series talking about TV and all that stuff. I'm your host, John.
And I'm your co-host, Jorge Sainz Urbina.
And yeah, today we're talking about Game of Thrones. A lot of people's favorite TV show, especially mine.
Yeah.
As well as its correlation with another famous fantasy genre, Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, perhaps a competitor or a copy.
Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today, Jorge.
All right.
So let's dive into it. So, okay, I personally think that Game of Thrones has not only shaped TV, but has pretty much shaped the entire fantasy genre in general. Like, there's been other titles, of course, that have made the fantasy genre what it is, but I think Game of Thrones has been very impactful, especially with the new show, House of Dragons, like the prequel to Game of Thrones. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree and disagree. Game of Thrones, it's revolutionized how a big budget in a TV show increases like popularity, especially Game of Thrones. That show is humongous. It's HBO's biggest show.
True.
You have Sopranos and Euphoria, but they don't hold a candle to Game of Thrones.
And those are good shows too. But yeah,
you could say that The Boys and perhaps even the new Lord of the Rings show. The reason they have high budgets is because of the success of Game of Thrones. Before that, I feel like TV shows were well budgeted, but they were also very low budgeted, using already made sets and, just like regular sitcoms, just kind of not cheap, but they had the budget that they needed to get by.
Yeah, like they've had their success, but then you see these cinematic shows that come out. Even stuff down to like Breaking Bad, stuff like that. You see the cinematic appeal. It's not like some sitcom, like you said.
Yeah, you can definitely see the impact that Game of Thrones had back when the show came out, and you can see it today. Like I just mentioned, like the Amazon Prime's TV show, like The Boys.
I would say though that the Game of Thrones show is better than the new Lord of the Rings show.
Oh, you mean the new prequel to Game of Thrones?
Both.
Oh, you're saying both.
But definitely House of Dragons, it's come out at the same time. It's a competitor of the new Lord of the Rings show, Rings of Power.
It definitely was. I don't know which one came first or how that came about, but they came out at the same week. Game of Thrones ended a week earlier than Lord of the Rings. Or I think I got that backwards. But the other way around. But I wouldn't say Game of Thrones, the main show, is a direct competitor to the Lord of the Rings new TV show. I would say more like the original Game of Thrones TV show should be compared to the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
All right. Explain.
But I wouldn't say The Hobbit, which is the prequel to Lord of the Rings, should be the competitor for the new Game of Thrones House of Dragons show.
Yeah.
Obviously, its biggest competitor was the new Lord of the Rings Rings of Power show. But I feel like Lord of the Rings was a book, right? And it came out around the 50s or 60s, written by J.R.R. Tolkien. And you can definitely see George R.R. Martin, the author of Game of Thrones. You can see some direct correlations. I don't want to say copy. Obviously, it's fantasy genre, and of course, the fantasy genre is a little bit limited, unlike action or even sci-fi. So it's kind of hard to say, George Martin directly copied Tolkien. Obviously, his is more like political.
I think it's hard to say they're copying in general because, like you said, even though they're both fantasy genres, they've got very different aspects. Sure, there's a dragon in Lord of the Rings, but the dragons are huge in Game of Thrones, and so that's their whole thing. They got the Iron Throne, and even down to the new prequel stems off the Targaryen line and the dragons that play a huge part. So I feel like to compare Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones is not correct. And the only way you compare them is that they're both medieval fantasy. That's the only way I would say you can compare them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the only way you can compare them. And each of them have their own magical kind of things. Like Game of Thrones has the undead type of like frost or ice. I don't know what you call them, ice kings or whatever.
Yeah,
ice monsters. While Lord of the Rings has more like tree monsters, and they have dwarves, and they have other species like elves and everything. While in Game of Thrones, there's just humans, I feel like, and dragons.
I mean,
there's also a giant, right?
Yeah, there's the
like the first and second season, there was that giant guy.
I agree with you that Lord of the Rings definitely, I think, has like a wider, diverse like creature cast and all that. But correct me if I'm wrong. I would say Game of Thrones has done to the TV industry and the fantasy genre what Lord of the Rings did for the movie industry when it came to the fantasy genre. Am I wrong?
Maybe?
Like, the new show does not do justice in comparison to what the Game of Thrones has done for the TV industry, I would say. The new Lord of the Rings show.
Well, that's hard to say. You know, in the past, like, 5 years, there's been the entertainment industry, I suppose, has gone up significantly, especially during, like, you know, like, I don't want to say the word, but the quarantine, especially then, it was everywhere, from YouTubers to Netflix, everywhere you could think of. Everyone was trying to be the next big streaming. Oh, what show?
Yeah.
What property can we use to make the biggest movie or show?
And people just getting their hands on what they could get, I feel like.
Obviously, this new Lord of the Rings show is more for, I suppose, the fans, or someone that wants to get into Lord of the Rings, but without watching the trilogy, perhaps. But obviously, when Game of Thrones came out, it was kind of like, it was like almost like nothing like it had come out before as a TV show.
Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings?
Game of Thrones.
Yeah, Game of Thrones.
As a TV show, nothing like it really came out.
Yeah. I just know Game of Thrones, there's a reason it's HBO's biggest show.
Yeah,
and it's been so impactful. Like, even down to, like, the disaster that was the last season, the last couple of seasons, they still had such a huge audience for House of the Dragon. And House of the Dragon's done it justice, in my opinion.
I mean, I think, yes, the final 2 seasons or so were disastrous, but obviously, I think it was like that just because of the large fandom that Game of Thrones made. They were expecting so much, and because there were so many people watching, it was just that much more disappointing, and that's why it made even like the news, and there were several articles about it.
Yeah.
If it wasn't as big as it was, no one would really care, and that's why people care about that last season, how it was disappointing, because it had such a huge fan base.
Yeah.
And a lot of people that like Game of Thrones also like Lord of the Rings.
So it's hard to compare them, you would say.
It is hard to compare them.
Some people will think one is better than the other, but I think you can't really compare them, because even though they both have made their impact on TV, film, and just the fantasy. Like, when you think of fantasy, you think of Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, or both. It's one of those two that you think of usually.
Yeah, they've become the medium of fantasy. They become like,
for good reason.
Yeah, they're the not default, but a good type of default.
Yeah. There's reason and cause behind this.
Yeah, totally. But overall, I think Game of Thrones has its strongs, and so does Lord of the Rings. And they're both fantastic shows and movies.
So yeah, it's hard to compare. They both have their pros and cons, I think.
Definitely.
I don't know if we've really covered it that much, but I feel like Game of Thrones, like, it stands that it has fundamentally changed cinematic TV, in my opinion. Definitely. You wouldn't have stuff that you have now without Game of Thrones.
Definitely. I would totally say that.
So yeah, well, we're kind of running out of time for right now.
No.
So maybe we'll release a more extended edition of it, but thank you for joining me today, Jorge.
Of course. Let me shake your hand.
Yeah. Cool. Well, tune in next time. Hopefully we'll get an extended edition of this.
Maybe.
Yeah. Well, Siren Nos.
Signing off. Goodbye.